Yo, what's up everybody? Welcome back to another video. This is a different look. This is actually the first Austin Dunham podcast, and I'm excited because we have a very first special guest, somebody that I do have some history with, somebody that you guys probably definitely know too, no other than Daniel from Fitness FAQs. How you doing, Daniel?
Good, Austin. Nice to connect again, man. It's been too long.
You were definitely one of the first people I was watching before I even created my channel. So you're definitely an OG in the space, and even me myself, I feel like I'm becoming more OG now too. I remember we actually met up in, what was that, 2017? We went to LA, collabed, and I still remember that cheat day like it was yesterday, man. That was a good time. But a lot of stuff has changed since then, and kind of in this podcast, I want to discuss some of the things that have changed with you in terms of your training, even when it comes to the calisthenics industry and the fitness industry as a whole. But first, let's start off. You just had a birthday, right?
Oh, yes. 31 years young.
31 years young. I think the last time I saw you in person, you were 26 or 26.
Yeah.
And I'm 27 now, man. I'm pushing 32. How has your training changed through the years? So let's say when you first started, was it solely calisthenics training? And if so, how did it progress to whatever it is now?
Yeah, so I started training when I was 17 years old, and the inception of that was through calisthenics. My inspiration for it was seeing people online on YouTube, coming across people like the Barbarians, Hannibal for King. This story is quite common for people that are around our age and came up with the internet in those days. And just starting out with the purely calisthenics stuff, you know, your push-ups, pull-ups, dips, rows, eventually progressing to things like muscle-ups. But it wasn't anything fancy, and it was just all the basics from the start. But one element and thread was always present, and that was hard work. And I'm just really grateful from the beginning that I had good mentors and role models that always steered myself and the community at large in a direction that gives a lot of fulfillment. So just like pushing yourself, setting goals, progressing, not getting distracted with all these fancy movements and stuff, just doing the tried and true movements with calisthenics, and put my heart and soul into that for a few years. But then I realized I'm not training my lower body. What's going on here? So it's like, you can do some pistol squats, you can do some bodyweight lunges, high reps, but eventually you get to a point, especially if you want to start building some more strength and more muscle mass, you've got to start incorporating some weights. So after 3 years of doing only calisthenics, I started introducing some weightlifting for my lower body, and just continue to do upper body calisthenics, maybe a little bit of weighted calisthenics as well, but predominantly bodyweight exercises for the upper body and introducing weights for the lower body, getting best of both worlds.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we have a very similar timeline in terms of I only focused on bodyweight training. I actually purposely skipped legs for a certain amount of time too. And then I was getting top heavy. I started adding weights. And nowadays I do pretty much a hybrid of everything, like weightlifting, calisthenics, weighted calisthenics, all the above. In terms of calisthenics as a training style, I've noticed personally that within almost 2017 and definitely 2020, with the pandemic, that there was definitely a lot of talk about calisthenics, and it was almost like a trend, because at that point in time, there wasn't a lot of people talking about it in terms of content. It was one of those new training styles, almost like CrossFit back in like 2010. Do you feel like calisthenics has reached a peak in terms of popularity? And if so, when do you think that was? Or do you think it's just as popular as it ever was and still getting more popular as a training style?
It's difficult because I feel like most hobbies or interests, it wax and wanes. It goes through peaks and troughs. And particularly with calisthenics, I feel it will remain something that's niche compared to more mainstream disciplines like just going to the gym, because there's a bit more complexity involved with learning how to do this stuff. There's still not as much information, at least in the public sphere. So if you go to a gym or something like that, there's less people that can teach you about this art compared to you go in, you want to build some muscle, let's jump on some machines, do some dumbbells and some free weights. And it's just not as cosmetic of an interest for a lot of people. Whether we like to agree with it or not, most people are driven by the desire for aesthetics, first and foremost. They get into the gym because they want to build self-confidence, build their physique, attract the opposite sex. It's the standard narrative. But with the calisthenics world, it's more performance-based at large. You get into it to learn some skills and build your body awareness, control, etc.
I'm not sure about you, but I think the reason why I love calisthenics as a training style when I first got into it was all I cared about was getting strong. I didn't care about how I looked. How I looked was almost like a byproduct of that. And my goals did change as I became stronger. But initially, it was more about strength for me. For you, was it more about strength or kind of a mixture of both, aesthetics and strength?
At the start, definitely strength, because I saw people doing movements that I couldn't. I saw muscle ups, I saw handstands, not that that involves strength, it's more skill, but more about what you could do with your body was interest first and foremost. But then after a while, you start building a little bit of muscle. You're like, wow, I'm getting the combination of both. That was always the allure for me. If you said to me, you can only look amazing, but do nothing with your body, wouldn't interest me. If you said you can do all these crazy movements, but if you walk around the street, no one would even know that you exercise, to be honest, that would not interest me either. So over time, it was the blend of both and just what you could do with your body as well as the look that calisthenics gave you as a base. That really hooked me.
Yeah, I definitely agree, man. Now, I've seen some of your training. I remember at one point in time, you were training the straddle planche like a lot, training the one-arm handstand a lot. And you're not a small guy. Like, you're like 6 feet, 185, 180 pounds. I'm not sure
Yep.
the other metric. That's spot on?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So me, myself, I'm about an inch shorter and about 10 to 15 pounds lighter. So you have a bigger frame, and for that reason, learning these skills are a lot harder for you. So in terms of your own personal routines, how have you found it in terms of learning these skills? And then after you learned it, maintaining it? Like, is it something that you have to consistently train in order to maintain? Or could you still bust out a straddle planche for like 5 seconds right now if you wanted to?
Strength is very specific for the most part, and it depends on the movement and how specific that strength is. The example being a planche, you've got that real specific joint angle position that you're holding. It's a straight arm movement. So you need to introduce those movement patterns consistently in order to be able to maintain a high standard. So for me, the acquisition of these skills required a lot of dedicated, specific practice. I don't want people to get it twisted like, oh, I can just do dips and just do pull-ups and I'll be able to do full planche or full front lever as an example. It's more of an efficient learning curve if you do the exercise itself in order to get it. The good news there is that once you've acquired something, the effort required to maintain or at least decrease the rate of decline is nowhere near as much as required to gain it in the first place. We all
Just
know
like
that.
muscle.
Exactly. That was my next point. It's like you get to a certain level of body fat or muscle mass, you can apply a sufficient stimulus and volume to be able to maintain that, which is awesome news. And that brings me on to the next point, and it's not discussed enough in fitness, I believe. It's all about reaching the destination, but no one cares about what happens afterwards. You hear so much about, oh, I went on this 60-day diet and I got this result, or I pushed myself really, really hard to acquire this strength skill and then I got it. What about afterwards? What can you do sustainably has been something that's been of more interest to me in recent times, because I see so many people cut to an extreme level of body fat percentage and then it's just rebound the complete opposite way. Whereas there's something kind of cool about the discipline required to be within the ballpark of having a great physique, having great strength levels. Not optimal in either way, but damn, it's something that you can be really proud of.
Yeah, I agree with that too, man. Speaking of recent times, in terms of your personal routine, it has probably seen – quite a bit of changes, over the past 3, 5, 6, 10 years. What is your current routine right now in terms of what you consistently do on a weekly basis? Is it a push pull legs sort of routine, upper lower? Like, what's your go to?
You guessed it straight away. The old push-pull legs is a personal favorite. You get the upper body frequency twice per week. You get the legs in there once a week because I'm not specializing in any specific like powerlifting objectives with squats and deadlifts. It's more for aesthetics and overall what my physique looks like with the legs. But hitting the upper body pull and push twice per week, I absolutely love that because I'm someone who likes to give a decent amount of intensity and volume in each session, where if I was to try and train the same upper body muscles 3-4 times a week, it would require a lot more restraint and you need to be more calculated with spreading that volume over more sessions. I'd rather just come in for those few sessions, know what I've been doing in the past and how I'm trying to progress, and it's just a bit easier to manage where I'm going with my training. As far as exercises are concerned, these days a lot more bent arm strength. I realize that I enjoy that so much more. Full range of motion training, whether it's dips, pull-ups, all those classic compound movements. The base of my routine is weighted calisthenics, so I'll start out with those movements because they're my priority, my bread and butter, and what I enjoy most. And towards the end of a workout, sprinkling in free weights, machines in more of a isolated manner to fully exhaust the muscles, really help with that hypertrophy. And it's just more interesting, to be fair with you, Austin, because anyone that's done the same thing for a decade plus needs to find novel ways to keep things interesting, but also in line with their training style. So I'm not just going to go out and only lift weights and be like, oh, I can still do bodyweight exercises, because that's not going to work. But I also enjoy the aspect of improving my calisthenics and then supplementing that with weights, because there's a lot more versatility with exercises. Your options are almost endless. And for me, I can see myself doing this indefinitely with this approach.
I agree, man. I think we follow quite literally the same approach in terms of our routines, exercise selection. It's very, very similar. Even me, myself, I used to train static skills before my actual reps and sets for probably 4 years straight. But I haven't in recent years, I think, because of the novelty thing, like you said, and the whole journey. Like, I almost love the idea of training for something and working towards it more so than actually gaining the skill itself. Because once I gained the skill, it was like, it's kind of boring. Like, I'm holding a 10-second planche now. Like, now what? Like, do I go to one arm? Like planches, and that gets into like a whole other realm of strength, which I believe to some degree, once you get to that really, really advanced strength to where you're doing really crazy things, it's almost like genetics and leverages play more of an effect into your actual training and effort, if that makes sense. Would you agree with that?
It definitely does. And you have to define what you'll be satisfied with and what success looks like to you. So for me personally, I was happy with achieving a 5-second straddle planche because I set myself that goal and I wanted to still be doing other exercises in my program, still train legs, still do weighted calisthenics, and then also achieve that. And just having that restraint to be able, I'm like going to stop at this point, and then just being at peace with that is great, because you create a lot less suffering by setting the goals that brings you the enjoyment, and then moving on from there is key. You can't just keep doing it all at once.
Makes perfect sense, yeah. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is your nutritional practices. Like in the bodybuilding industry, it's always with the bulking, cutting, protein intake. Like, what's your take on that? Like, do you calorie count? How do you go about your nutrition? Is it just whole foods?
This might surprise some people because they might assume that I'm very meticulous with tracking macros, calories down to the T, because I have objectively a pretty lean physique all the time. And the answer is that I just eat intuitively. I really don't overcomplicate it. I eat quite consistently Monday to say Thursday, because that's just a standard work week. For the most part, you can eat similar breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I just be really mindful of hitting sufficient protein intake for my body And we know from the research it's at least a gram per pound of body weight, give or take, depending on if you're bulking, maintaining, or cutting. But I know that I'm definitely exceeding that. That's very important for muscle mass. But for me in particular, it's almost like a cheat code for satiety. So by having protein, it's a very satiating food. It fills you up compared to eating the equivalent amount in, say, just straight carbohydrates. Nice. So my big picture look at things is, as you said there, it probably comes as no surprise. It's mainly whole foods, lean source of protein. I'm big on potatoes, once again, for that satiety. Introducing multiple servings of fruit per day. Decent volume of vegetables as well, once again, for just that bulk to your food and just keeping yourself full. And a practical strategy that I highly recommend to people, if you don't want to track calories, you can't just be flippant and expect things to work by not measuring anything. What I mean is I track my weight every day, and then I take the average after a week, and then I can use that as a reference point for manipulating my food intake accordingly, depending on my objective. That has been really healthy for me because I'm not too stressed or anxious about the day-to-day fluctuations. I don't have to measure every single meal because I'm pretty consistent with the approach that I'm taking. And it just allows that freedom to make adjustments on a more long-term basis, which is what matters most.
Gotcha. So in terms of your physique, building muscle, I believe you've been through one bulk cycle where you purposely were eating a lot more calories and obviously putting on body fat. Was it just one throughout this whole entire time period?
Yeah, it's a really good question because people would assume with my answer there that this approach that I'm doing now has worked all the time, but it changes depending on where you are within your journey. So as Austin correctly said, when I was, say, 3-ish years into training, I was on a fairly aggressive bulk for a good 2 to 3 years. So as we said earlier with my stats, I'm around 185-ish pounds now, 85 kilos. But when I was like in my early 20s, I was up around that 92, 93 kilos for a decent amount of time. And then that environment with a surplus allowed me to be in a anabolic state, so net calorie surplus, and that allowed the building blocks to build the tissue that I do have now. So I would recommend bulking, but I think it's so overstated with the extent and rate in which it needs to be done. People get way too fat way too quickly when there's so many negatives to that. Like you think about the health consequences of doing that. Not great on the body, highly stressful. Think about the practical perspective of that. We, as men, I hope we like to dress well and present ourselves nicely. Dude, if you're fluctuating 10 kilos difference in a rapid time, you've got to almost have 2 to 3 sets of different clothes if you want it to fit you nicely. So there's a few perspectives on more patient bulking process.
That's actually what I'm doing right now because anytime I've ever bulked in the past, I've realized that I've done it way too soon, way too fast. And for that reason, I find myself quitting. I don't like the way my strength is affected with it. I don't like the way I look. So nowadays, I'm going very slowly. So about 1 to 3 pounds a month, if that. It's very slow. And I definitely prefer it this way.
And it's particularly important for doing calisthenics and weights because we're doing both relative and absolute strength movements. So I don't blame you for feeling that sensation of like confused in your body because I've had the same thing. It's you're getting heavier, your weightlifting stuff is easier because you can push more heavy loads, which is great for strength and muscle. Then your calisthenics stuff, you're like, man, I used to be able to do this certain number of reps easily, and with each passing month, I'm getting weaker on that despite trying really hard with bodyweight exercise.
Now, this is a weird question, but do you believe if somebody's bulking while you doing calisthenics, so it's a relative strength curve, do you believe that added weight acts as a form of progressive overload?
Oh, 100%. Yeah, we are dealing with our body weight as resistance in the exercise. So if you are going on a surplus and you're even maintaining your numbers, you are getting stronger.
Exactly. And I realized too, For example, let's say I'm able to do 10 reps of freestanding handstand push-ups at my normal 10% body fat weight, but now I'm at 15% body fat, and I have to go down to another variation, or maybe my reps go down. But as long as I keep doing the exercise while I'm building, whenever it comes back down to the cut, I'm actually stronger than what I was initially, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm not sure if it did.
Yeah,
but
and that's the
yeah.
ultimate incentive for being lean and going on a cut, because it's the complete opposite to bodybuilding and powerlifting. When you're involved in activities where you've got to push external weight, if your body weight goes down, it gets harder. Your leverages get worse and you don't feel great, and your training doesn't feel great. It's the exact opposite with calisthenics, where even though you're in an energy deficit and you've got your times where you don't have as much vigor for your training, when you're actually doing the movements, you feel like a feather. So it's this real strange, like, mental situation that happens.
Yeah. Now, recently in a YouTube video, I mentioned that I saw about 80% of my progress in terms of strength and even muscularity within the first 2 to 3 years of my training from a novice. When did you see most of your progress, if you had to backtrack and look at it holistically?
Definitely with the calisthenics strength stuff in the first 3 years, exactly the same situation as you, for a few reasons. Because I was lighter, I was more focused on just doing the calisthenics, and I'd say that everything else equal, being 17 to 20 training versus 27 to 30 training, your recovery is much more enhanced just based on just being a younger person. I would say in terms of the muscle side of things, it wasn't until I went on that multiple year bulk that I made the most progress, because training was progressively overloading. I was doing more volume and I was in a state of body fat where I was able to actually put on muscle mass. So this question, it's very complicated, but for me, that was my personal situation. I'd say depending on whether we're talking calisthenics or weights, calisthenics strength, or using weights and calisthenics to build muscle, that rate of progress really depends on your training age as well as your nutritional intake, whether you're bulking, cutting, or maintaining.
That makes sense. Yeah, there's a lot of variables at play for sure. Now, if you had to go back and maybe talk to your younger self or change anything, would you? Or would you do everything the same exact way that led you to where you're at right now in terms of your training and nutrition, all that stuff?
This is where, when I give advice, I put myself in the position of the person receiving advice, and I understand the reality. We can speak to younger people, giving them the wisdom through our knowledge gained through years in the trenches and reading stuff, and tell them, I made this mistake, I would do this differently. And I know that if I heard someone saying this when I was a teenager, I'd hear it, be like, yeah, cool, bro, but then I'll just go ahead and do the approach that I want to do. So for that reason, I'll give the cliche of, I am happy I did things the way I did because I had to learn through certain setbacks of injury, slow progress, just doing a certain approach and wondering, why isn't it working? And then trying harder and it's still not working, and having to humble myself and actually apply lessons from resources that I trust, instead of just trying to use my own ego to overcome a situation. I would say, if I was to go back, the one thing I would do is be more focused on an objective at a time. With calisthenics, we can do so many exercises. We can do sets and reps, we can do weighted calisthenics, we can do freestyle, we can do different static positions. When I was younger, I wanted it all. And that resulted in slow progress. It resulted in why it took me so long to get that planche to the level that I wanted. I would just tell myself, you need to spend a longer period of time being consistent on a goal. And a longer period of time doesn't mean just sticking to it for a few weeks. I'm talking like months at a time, dedicating half a year to gaining strength towards this movement. Not spending a few weeks on it, then changing variations, changing the order, changing my workout. I would tell my younger self, you've got to be driven, consistent, and do not let yourself be overcome by external allures of flashy movements. Just stay true to the goal that you want to do it, and then move on. Because I just now can't stand the feeling of having an objective and then kind of like half going in and playing around with all this other stuff. And I've reflected on this, and it's a way for me to have an excuse if I don't reach it. So I can be like, oh, I didn't get that straddle planche because I was doing legs and I was doing all these other goals. And it's like an out from not being dedicated and putting effort into what I actually want.
Makes perfect sense. Overall, just being more focused and also patient with your training. And I believe that's something that I learned early on too, which was good in hindsight. I would focus on one push skill and one pull skill at a time. And then once I learned that, or got to a point where I was comfortable, that's when I would sort of make changes. And in some cases, the carryover effect for other things happened for me too. Not with everything, but for some things. Like, for example, I always get the example, human flag. Like, I've never trained the human flag ever. But I think because of the weighted pull-ups and all this other stuff, I was able to bust out, about 5 to 10 seconds with it. So,
for sure. I do the same thing now with being selective with goals. A good one is, say, the handstand push-up, where you're working on that. Your program has to be dedicated to that. You've got to do all of the constituent aspects and be highly focused with one thing at a time. You've got to have your handstand balance on point. You've got to progressively overload your body weight strength movements, your pike push-up, progressing to the wall, and then integrating the strength and balance later. And what I've found with that is I have to step away from focusing on my dips as much. I love doing weighted dips. But then with my main goal being the handstand push-up, I have to dedicate my resources to the handstand push-up. But the good thing is, by leaving that aside for a moment, when I come back to the weighted dip, as you said, I haven't lost anything because I'm still working those prime mover muscles involved in pushing. So it's a very freeing feeling to know that your hard work will translate to an extent. You don't have to do everything at once.
Perfect sense, yeah. Now, we spoke about how you just had a birthday, and we're both getting older. Now, have you realized through getting older, has that affected your training in any sort of way in terms of your recovery, in terms of your joint pain? Like, how has age affected your training so far?
Fortunately, I'm still not at the point, being 31, where I've noticed a drastic difference. From anecdotal experience of other people, I hear around that 35 years old is when you start to see a bit more like tangible, it's taking me 2 days to recover instead of 1, and my joints hurt from an exercise I didn't before. But fortunately, the people that are listening to this, if you're smart with your training over time, it shouldn't affect you to this point. With being younger, you, as I alluded to before, you're a bit more reckless. You're like, I can recover from anything. I can train 6 days a week, and you can get away with a lot of things. Your nutrition doesn't have to be as on point. You can eat randomly, different times of the day, and still go and train. You can have, tons of late nights going out with friends and stuff like that, and it won't affect you the next day. And I found that being kind of reckless with my training was offset when I was younger just by being better able to recover. So now, being older, you'd think that I would have a harder time recovering, but it's offset now by the fact that I'm a lot more calculated with what I do. I'm getting my 8+ hours of sleep a night. I'm more diligent with my progress of my training program. I'm not just ramping it up 1 week from 0 to 100, more dedicated with my nutrition. And I feel that has offset the chronological age increase being a factor in my recovery.
That makes perfect sense. And that's awesome. I mean, even looking at you, man, you haven't aged a day since 26, bro. I need to know the skincare
baby face
routine.
Genetics. Let's go.
Do you have a skincare routine? This is random, but do you have a skincare routine?
Yeah.
Like, you do?
That's
Okay.
a good question. Yeah. I think it's all the basics, as you've known with the fitness FAQs philosophy. It's, for me, because I'm a pasty white boy, you got to put that sunscreen on. Don't want to get the sun affecting like leather on the skin. Just basics, man. Cleanse once a day. moisturize twice a day. That's it.
Awesome. Foundational stuff, man, and workouts and also skincare.
Drink that
Routines
water.
for everything, though. That too. That too. Now, one thing that has gotten fairly popular in terms of the age thing is that when guys usually approach the late 30s, early 40s, sometimes even 50s, I'm sure you heard of TRT. Would you ever consider TRT for yourself, or is that completely off the table no matter how your natural testosterone levels are in the future?
Ooh, controversial topic, but definitely one that needs to be spoken about. I would be lying if I said I didn't consider it, but not to any serious extent. It'd be the same as saying, have you considered taking performance-enhancing drugs to, improve your strength and muscularity? Of course, you consider it, but then at this stage in my life, it's not something that I seriously consider because in the future, hoping to start a family. So we know one of the things, if you start supplementing exogenous testosterone, there's a potential for infertility issues. So at this stage, that one thing has made me not that keen on it at this stage. I still feel it's in its infancy as far as like being tested in terms of the long-term outcomes associated with it, because it's just something that's been prescribed a lot more readily in the last few decades, at least to a more mainstream level. So my short answer is no, I haven't considered it seriously. In the future, I may, after those boxes have been ticked, but I'd have to see a lot more clear evidence. I'd have to have a really good protocol with it. And honestly, you'd have to be very transparent with your audience, because I'd like to think you and myself will be doing what we do, teaching fitness-related stuff for a long time to come. And you can't be out there telling your fellow 40, 50-year-old guys, just do my routine and, you'll get similar results to me with the principles I follow. But leaving out the fact that you're on a little bit of help with the TRT. I feel that's very dishonest, disingenuous. So if I was to, I would make that public. But for now, not something that I'd consider. I would much rather focus on what is in my control to influence at this stage. So we know with testosterone, the biggest lever that you can pull is sleep. The people that are considering doing testosterone around our age of 30, but they're out partying all the time, they're staying up late just watching Netflix when they could go to bed an hour earlier, that's just asinine in my opinion. So getting the sleep under control, getting your vitamin D, making sure your nutrition's on check, making sure that you're on a healthy body composition, perhaps looking into some few supplements that may help you. People can research this stuff. There's a few over-the-counter things that you can take to uplift certain areas to help with testosterone. But what I'm saying is people give up way too soon. They look to that as a quick, easy fix that they can do instead of making really tangible changes to their lifestyle to improve it.
Makes sense. And even for me myself, of course, I thought about it too. But as you said, I would try to make sure like everything else is optimized in terms of my sleep, my nutrition, and I would try to prolong that as far and as long as possible. It would have to be really, really bad for me to probably get on something like that. I would not want to get on it for like vanity reasons. Also, like I reached my peak. I need to hop on some TRT. It's like
you hear more the people that are taking it. It's more that their quality of life is severely hampered. You hear about the associated downfall of having low testosterone. You get very apathetic, poor mood, low energy, a real bad like lust for life and like drive to do things. If you are having those symptoms, then you really have to take a look at your lifestyle as a consideration, especially if you're in your 30s as an example. What have you seen from your research, Austin, about when are people leaning into the idea of taking testosterone?
It seems to be in their mid-40s, early to mid-40s, I would say, is what I've noticed personally based on the people I know who are taking it and my small amount of research on it so far. Yeah. So I'm not even considering the thought until then. And it would have to be like glaring signs to me that I need to do this. But based on my genetics and what I've seen in my dad and kind of how I am now, I doubt I'll have to.
Yeah.
Hopefully not.
It's tough because these discussions are being really glorified for the minority. I know that there's trends of men on average having lower testosterone than, say, our predecessors 50 years ago, but I'd say that that's by virtue of combination of environment and lifestyle factors, and I think that people give up way, way, way too soon.
I agree. Now, moving on, I've gotten some slight controversy in terms of what I believe are the strength standards held to the average man. So, for example, I believe every man should be able to do between 10 and 15 pull-ups, should be able to do 30 push-ups. I believe men should hold a standard to themselves. Like if I was to pick an average guy, I'm like, you should be able to do 10 pull-ups. Some people agree, some people don't. But for you, if you were to speak to an average guy, what strength standard do you believe that each man should hold to themselves in terms of the foundational exercises? So pull-ups, push-ups, and let's say dips in terms of reps.
I don't want to give a boring answer, but I'm in line with what you're saying. It should come as no surprise that you should be able to rep out, 20 plus push-ups, at least 10 plus full range of motion dips, at least 5 full range of motion pull-ups, and not neglecting the other parts of your body, having a respectable squat. So if you can't squat at least hip crease to 90 degrees with your body weight on the bar, probably something that needs a bit of work in the lower body department. Being able to, same thing, like deadlift your body weight. I think these as a really minimum standard are definitely achievable for the average person, because these strength standard discussions depend on who we're speaking to. Are we talking to the average person that has a 9 to 5, a family, or are we talking to the university kid who has like 20 hours of class a week, all this discretionary time without any responsibilities, and the hormonal advantage of being younger? So I agree with you. There's this like minimum threshold that with half a year of training, 2 to 3 days a week for an hour, you can achieve those numbers that you said with bodyweight reps. And then we could start talking about just lifting weights in the different movement patterns, as we said.
No, I agree, man. That was a great answer, actually, because there are a bit of nuances in terms of who we're speaking to. So I definitely agree with that, man. Your numbers were slightly lower than mine, but I like that. Good answer, man.
I'm a man that just likes to get people to buy in. You give people a level of success, they're going to go above and beyond that. So it's between us, we're in the field, we think these numbers are pretty like on the lower end to really achievable. And I think as an introduction, they should be, because that builds the confidence and competence to go beyond that.
I agree. Now we're approaching the end, and I'm going to ask you a few more questions. And for the last question, it's going to be a bonus question that's outside of fitness, actually, because I'm sure you see my brand. I've kind of diversified in terms of not just fitness, but like overall male self-improvement, dating, relationships, the politics with marriage even. So I want to hear some of your takes on that. But before we get into that, what are the top, let's say, 3 to 5 calisthenics exercises that you will always do, that are bread and butter in your routine that have always done and will always do?
Let's do upper body, and let's work through the different movement patterns. So first of all, we've got the vertical motion. We have pull-ups. Absolutely think they should be a foundation in any routine. We have the different grip widths that we can play with. We can go unilateral on one side. We can add weight to the exercise. There's just a lifetime of progress inherent to the pull-up. Next one, I'll treat as a vertical exercise as well. We have the dip, aka the squat of the upper body. You can throw these on rings. You can play with different variations there with flared, tucked, everything in between. You can add weight to them and keep increasing them over time. Fantastic movement. So that's 2. Let's go a third one in the vertical plane. I'd say the handstand push-up. I've mentioned this before in the podcast and absolutely love it. The combination of strength and balance as an end stage makes it a really gratifying movement, and it just feels really powerful to be able to control your body through space with that exercise. And there's so many things leading up to that. You can use the wall, you can do deficit, and the list goes on with that movement. Moving on, I would say a rowing pattern, so a horizontal pull. So beginners, just getting your bodyweight rows on lock is absolutely key. Once again, you can add weight to that. Progressions, lifetime. You can go unilateral, and you can even start introducing some front lever type of pull-ups where you get the skill component of that, and that will definitely keep you occupied for like a really long time. A movement that I heavily feel is slept on is the push-up. We came back to our discussion before where we said the average person really struggles with push-ups. It's an exercise that requires you to push a significant portion of your body weight, and if you're not accustomed to it, it's challenging. It's got a lot to offer. There's so many different angles that you can practice doing push-ups. As I said before, it's not as common in mainstream, but weighted push-ups are fantastic. Highly slept on movement, great accessory movement towards the middle of your training. What are we at now, Austin? Is that 4?
I think that was 4. And you pretty much hit all planes of motion. Yeah. So that makes sense. In terms of the weighted push-up, do you still prefer the one with the belt and the Smith machine sort of variation, or this plate stacking method?
I prefer the dip belt over the mid spine, just because it's something that you can do independently. The weights stay in place, so it's a lot better for independent training as opposed to like having to balance the weights on your upper back.
I agree. But, I think I haven't done that movement a lot is because of setup. Anything that has like a long setup, I just tend to avoid. So I'll do like just a different variation. You find the setup to be like kind of just a bit longer than usual?
It's annoying, but if you've got the luxury of training at home, you can kind of have little stations set up for everything. Even if you had just 3 platforms elevated, you could just jump in and do it like that.
Makes sense. Now, last fitness question. What do you believe is the most, or in your opinion, an overrated body weight movement exercise that you really don't spend a lot of time on, you wouldn't spend a lot of time on or include in your routine for like at all?
I've spoken about this before, and it's a bit of a controversial one. And it's not saying that I don't like the exercise. I think it is a good movement to do once you've got the parts. That exercise is the muscle up. Beginners get into calisthenics. I want to learn the muscle up. They've seen people doing it in CrossFit or just in viral videos online. It looks cool, right? You're throwing your body around in space, and if you're at the gym doing it, you're going to get some looks like, what's this guy doing going above the cable crossover and filming and checking our reaction as we watch him do it.
Yeah.
I find, sorry, with this one, Austin, that people try and do the whole movement too soon as opposed to just getting really good at pull-ups and dips, and they can do it for free.
Absolutely. The muscle up, I agree with you completely, by the way. I would have said the muscle up too. I feel the muscle up is one of those movements where it's definitely cool and it's efficient, but it's not effective. And much like the 90-degree handstand push-up too, it's one of those movements where combining 2 movements into one, it's an efficient movement. You get a lot of muscle groups worked out one time, but it's not effective. If I wanted to be more effective, I would simply just separate the 2 movements, so pull-ups and dips, or pseudo-planche push-ups and handstand push-ups separately, right? But
Yes. And a great way to do that, using the 90-degree push-up example, is because the combination of the 2, so the handstand push-up down to bent arm planche and reverse, requires 2 movements. You'd be working on your handstand push-ups and bent arm planche in isolation, and a great way to bridge the gap and learn the specificity of the exercise, at least in part, is doing eccentrics. So I'd argue that you get a lot more total work in by doing handstand push-ups, bent arm planche holds, and 90-degree eccentrics, instead of just trying to brute force the entire movement. And then you get what you just said is you never really overload any individual part, which is a limitation.
I agree. That's definitely a smart training protocol that you just said right there too. So moving on, then this is the last thing outside of fitness. I think on the last podcast too, I kind of asked you more things outside of just fitness because you're more private with your personal life, which I definitely respect you for. I'm also private with my personal life in terms of relationships. But currently, are you in a relationship right now? or are you single man?
I'm in a happy relationship, Austin.
Okay. And in terms of like family, marriage, when do you see yourself doing that or moving that forward? Or you haven't thought about that yet?
It's something that I'll take at the pace required. And the fortunate part about that as a male is you have a little bit more luxury in terms of that timeline. So given that we can keep reproducing, shooting out those little soldiers well into our 60s and 70s if we wanted to, you have a little bit more discretionary time to do that in a more calculated way. So it's something that I would like to have in the future, but just making sure that the relationship comes first and foremost and giving it the time it requires to foster that really deep, sincere connection, making sure that you've got all those shared values and not just getting overcome by that honeymoon phase of the first year and a half, 2 years, because that can often delude you into perhaps a real reality that comes around that 4-year mark in most relationships on average.
You sound pretty rational, Daniel. Really, really rational. I'm not sure if you heard of the whole manosphere, red pill sort of movement, but at least in America, I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but there's a lot of talk like revolving around the marriage laws. Is marriage a good idea for men? You know, for certain aspects, especially if you have your own business and I'm not sure of the income of your partner, but if your income is essentially higher than your partner's, like, you know, the whole politics behind that. Have you considered that too? Or are you more, are you set in terms of marriage and you have hopes for it?
100%. Definitely have looked into it, because to be able to build a business, you need to look at all aspects of things to make sure that it's congruent with what you want. And just blindly going into arguably the most important agreement that you'll make in terms of a marriage without knowing the facts relative to your location, jurisdiction, etc., would just be completely silly. And you hear of some really intelligent guys being completely unaware of this domain. They're so switched on in every other part of their life, but they haven't even considered what happens in the event of X. What happens if we're married and we don't have kids? What happens if we're married and we have kids? Not having any awareness of these factors or things that you can do in order to try and mitigate your losses in an event of the worst case scenario. So definitely have looked into it. Need to consider it because, as you said, especially if you have a business and there's like certain things that you want to have in place for passing on to the next generation, etc., you need to look at the complexities of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Last question, Daniel. Would y'all happen to have met on dating apps, or was this in person? Did you meet her through a social group? Like, where'd you meet her?
I met her through apps, but found out later on that she was going to one of the gyms that I go to as well.
Awesome. I've met quite a few women that way too. Actually, where I see them at the gym, we never speak at the gym, but I later see them on a dating app, and that's how we end up making the connection.
Yeah. I was so conflicted because I usually have this principle of not dating in my place of work because, man, it can be really awkward if you've got your time in the gym there and you've maybe seen someone and it doesn't work out and they insist on going to the same place, and you just have this like air of just tension knowing that they're in the same place.
Yeah,
Fortunately that's been working out so far.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you, Daniel, for your honest, rational answers in fitness and also the bonus questions too. I'm sure people will appreciate that insight. Y'all don't forget, check out Daniel, channel Fitness FAQs pretty much everywhere, Instagram, YouTube. I'm sure you guys already follow him. But yeah, thanks for coming on, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.
It was a pleasure, man. Well done on your first podcast. That was a great conversation.
Thanks, man.